Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation with changemakers working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable, carbon-neutral society. And I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. You know, stories shape our perceptions of the world and the climate crisis. Unfortunately, most major media companies have only started to pay close attention to climate issues in recent years, often setting up their first environmental or climate desks. And yet those are still understaffed to tease apart the complex narrative that describes the challenge we and other animals on the planet face. For 57 years, the Media Freedom Foundation's Project Censored has released an annual list of the most underreported stories of the year. The environment and social justice issues are heavily featured in its State of the Free Press 2023 report. Mickey Huff, director of the Project Censored program and president of the Media Freedom Foundation, as well as Andy Lee Roth, associate director of the program, wrote an article for Earth911, which we recently published, called Corporate Media Fiddle as the Planet Burns. It's about the environmental stories that were almost entirely ignored in 2022. Andy Lee Roth joins me to talk about the stories and how the press can improve its environmental coverage. You can learn more about Project Censored and its State of the Free Press 2023 report at projectcensored.org. That's project-censored.org. Welcome to the show, Andy. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Mitch. It's a pleasure to be on Earth911 with you.
Well, you know, we think these are important topics and people should be covering them. But before we jump into the stories that were censored in 2022, tell me about how the Media Freedom Foundation came to be and how do you keep doing this work? It's been 47 years.
Yeah. So the Media Freedom Foundation is the nonprofit sponsor of Project Censored. So it is what allows us to operate as a 501c3 nonprofit. But the real work, and so the Media Freedom Foundation itself is constituted of a board of people who are experts in one way or another in media analysis and critical assessments of the state of the free press in the United States. But it's Project Censored that does the main body of the work. And the part of Project Censored that I'm most closely involved with is what we call our Campus Affiliates program, which is a network of several dozen college and university campuses across the United States and some years spanning the globe. This year, the stories that we'll be talking about have all undergone basically a year-long review process that begins with students in college and university campuses digging independent news stories for topics that are either being ignored by the corporate media or covered in a partial way by the corporate media, where partial could mean either incomplete or slanted or biased. So this year, for instance, the stories that we're going to talk about are selected from several hundred candidate stories that were considered in the previous 12-month cycle that were researched by 207 students from 10 different college and university campuses. And this is, in effect, the 47th cohort of Project Censored students who have engaged in this business of documenting kind of slant and pitfalls and blind spots in corporate news coverage of important issues.
I'm curious, what do some of the former cohort members go on to do?
Well,
did media or did they work in other contexts?
It would be across the board. I mean, one of the aims of Project Censored is to have a more media literate population in general, because media literacy is crucial to citizenship, as schools across the country, not just colleges and universities, but elementary and middle and high schools are beginning to acknowledge. And of course, it's important to have a media literate population because it's never been more difficult to interpret the kind of deluge of information that comes at us every day. But to go back directly to your question, one of our former Project Censored students, Nolan Higdon, is now working with the project himself, a professor in Northern California. And Nolan literally wrote the book on fake news. So some of our people continue on and work with us. Shaylee Voidal, an alum of North Central College in Illinois, is currently the project's editorial associate. But really, beyond necessarily trying to train a next generation of journalists or critical media literacy educators, the goal of the project is to have students, when they finish their college degree and go out into the workforce and back to their communities, to have students to have as part of who they are as community members, as citizens, a sense of critical media literacy and a sense of how the media work and how the media shape and frame our understanding of the world. And that's a bigger goal, I think, for the project than necessarily being an incubator for the next round of independent investigative journalists, although it's always thrilling when we have people like Nolan and Shaylee who continue to make this kind of work their livelihood as well as something they did in school.
Well, we certainly need more media literacy because we have been, as you said, deluged with new media over the course of the past 30 years. And I think it has radically changed the way discourse takes place. So let's talk censored stories. And by the way, folks, check out the article, Corporate Media Fiddle as the Planet Burns. There are links to the news organizations that broke these stories so you can follow and actually read about this. And Andy and Mickey summarized that beautifully there. So let's jump in. Tell us about the EPA's suppressed reports about the dangers related to 12,000 different household and industrial chemicals. Who broke the story and what was it?
I love starting with this story, Mitch, because this is, although it sounds on the face of it like a bad news story, this is actually in its own way a good news story. It shows the power of independent investigative journalism to create positive social change. We'll come back to that after we do some bad news stuff first. So this story was originally reported by Sharon Lerner for The Intercept. And what Lerner did is went back and looked at these substantial risk reports. They're known as Section 8E reports after the section of the Toxic Substances Control Act that authorizes the EPA to monitor any kind of substances that pose a substantial risk to injury or health, the environment. So Lerner went back and looked at these documents after noting that around 2019, i.e. in the middle of the Trump administration presidency, that the EPA had simply stopped publishing these reports. And normally the EPA would publish several hundred of these reports each year. And these reports are public disclosures of potential risks to serious things. Like this isn't like, oh, your skin might itch if you're exposed to this chemical. This is stuff like eye corrosion, brain damage, damage to the nervous system, chronic toxicity. And these reports had simply disappeared. So Lerner began documenting these, found that just one of 1,240 that had been submitted were actually publicized by the EPA on their ChemView database. There are two or three more steps to this story.
Sure.
One is, of course, chemical industry has been opposed to this kind of information being made public. They argue, probably in self-interested ways, that this kind of reporting undermines confidential trade secrets and proprietary information. And there's good evidence, Lerner reported, that the EPA was in effect the EPA under Trump was caving to industry pressure to suppress these reports, to not make them public through the normal channels.
So I am actually familiar with ChemView, and you have to have a little bit of expertise to dig in. A lot of folks just wouldn't know there wasn't information there. How did the reporter figure that out?
I don't know for sure what tipped Lerner and The Intercept off on this story. Is not something, I mean, I think this, I'll speculate for a moment.
Sure.
if you're tracking the EPA as an investigative reporter, then ChemView is the kind of thing you might well know about and track regularly. But I think you're quite right. Ordinary citizens aren't tracking probably ChemView, even if we might be somewhat knowledgeable about, say, the dangers of Roundup or whatever.
Well, does that suggest we need reporters who are essentially scientists?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need reporters who are scientifically literate.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what journalism is supposed to do. Journalism, one of the roles of journalism that you're taught as soon as you take kind of an intro to journalism class, or if you're in my sociology of media course, we talk about, well, what are some of the kind of conventionally understood roles of journalism? And one of them is as a watchdog. Mm-hmm. We as ordinary citizens don't necessarily have time to monitor all the things, to monitor ourselves, all the things that we might want to know about. Right. And we, insofar as we have a trustworthy press, we rely on journalists to sound the alarm, to play that watchdog role, right?
We do rely on them, but can we rely on them based on what you're describing? Are they staffed well enough, for instance?
Right. I mean, and that's and I would want to redirect that question a little bit and say, in this case, right, all the stories that are on the Project Censored Top 25 story list every year dating back to the first year in 1976 are on those lists because they haven't been well covered by corporate media, so-called mainstream or establishment press outlets. So I would say, I think there's a staffing issue, there's a scientific literacy issue, but there's also a sense of, there's a sense, I think, that it's important, an important distinction between independent media and corporate news media. And this story was not covered by corporate news media. It was covered by an independent news outlet, The Intercept, and Sharon Lerner, the independent reporter who we've been talking about. So I think there's a sensibility that is also part of the picture. I think some of the other things we may discuss later today will allow us to come back and talk more about that dynamic. But I want to come back to one more thing about this story. Lerner's report was subsequently cited as having been key to a lawsuit brought by the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, PEER, who filed freedom of information requests to try to get some of this suppressed information. When the EPA refused to do so, then PEER sued the EPA. Their lawsuit was ultimately successful. I think within a month or two of the PEER lawsuit being filed, the EPA began publishing these substantial risk reports, these Section 8E reports again. And so there's a kind of, this is the good news part that I wanted to come back to, the power of investigative journalism combined with the role played by PEER, in effect, whistleblowers, right, using the Freedom of Information Act. You combine all these, and we now have a chance to know about a story that might have never been reported otherwise. And the EPA is held, in effect, accountable by, as a result of some of this journalism. So this is one of my favorite stories in this year's list for that reason. It shows that good investigative reporting does not necessarily simply inform the public, but can actually create positive social change.
I completely agree with that. In fact, my background includes having done this with regard to cryptographic intrusions in public discussion back in the 90s. The problem that we have, though, is that the light of the press moves like the eye of Sauron. It doesn't stay focused on these things. We tend to move on to another area. And how, that's the question I always come back to, because the coverage we did back in the day about privacy didn't change the trajectory as much as I would have hoped it would have, because we couldn't keep the focus. What can the press do to continue to follow up on a story like this? Do we need somebody who is reading the Federal Register and ChemWise every day.
Yeah. I mean, I think we also need that no doubt that, all right. So reporters need release time to dig.
Yeah.
And find stories, right? And not to be like doing kind of cookie cutter reporting where they use the same formulaic. But I think we also need expansions of the definition of news, right? Mm-hmm. One of our Project Censored judges, Bob Hackett, who's a media scholar in Canada, has this great line that I love to use. He says, corporate news is about what went wrong today, but very seldom about what goes wrong every day. And I think
they want to treat everything as breaking news rather than
exactly.
A developing story.
So part of the kind of conventional definition of news hooks on things like recency and novelty, right? And the trouble is when you have systemic social problems that are ongoing, then you don't it's harder for those things. It's harder for those issues to get the kind of traction in the news because they go against the grain of that emphasis on recency and novelty.
So I think the next story that you called out is an illustration of this as well, and that is the coverage of the International Monetary Fund's analysis of fossil fuel industry subsidies. So they receive $11 million a minute in subsidies from governments around the world, which totals $5.9 trillion a year, which is about 6% of global GDP, which is simply going into their pockets as subsidies. Huge story, wasn't covered very well by a lot of organizations. Who broke the story about the real problem and tell us what that problem was?
So we give credit here to Damian Carrington, a reporter with The Guardian, and Eduardo Garcia from Tree Hugger for breaking this story. This was one that, kind of backstage as these stories are going through an annual review process, we have a kind of internal dialogue about, I'm sure this story is amazing, but surely some major corporate news outlet covered the IMF study that Carrington and Garcia's reporting was based on. And this was one where it was quite stunning as we did that review, and the stories here have all undergone no fewer than kind of 5 separate stages of review before they make the top 25 story list at the end of the year. This story hadn't been covered. That $5.9 trillion figure is like astronomical. And one way that maybe we can get our heads around it is the US median household income in 2021 was a little over $70,000. Mm-hmm. So the average American household would have to work for about 83,350 some years to make as much money as the fossil fuel industry received in governmental subsidies from governments around the world in 2020, right? That's what $5.9 trillion means, 83,350 some years of working at the median household income. It's a huge figure.
It's insane. But the other thing that I was struck by in the coverage is that they only focused on the financial data. Yeah. Didn't then look at what that spending was enabling in terms of negative social and environmental impacts.
Yeah. And this is something I think that Eduardo Garcia's reporting is especially strong on this. He makes the simple point that when governments subsidize the fossil fuel industry, and the key element of the IMF report is that this is done both directly and indirectly, and I'll say more about the indirect subsidies in a moment, which are key to the $5.9 trillion figure that we're kind of rolling our eyes over right now. Mm-hmm. Garcia makes the simple but profound point that when governments are in effect subsidizing fossil fuels, they're using financial resources for that purpose that could be used for other public goods, right? So healthcare, education, better public transportation systems, all these, which we often hear from our political leadership, those would be wonderful things, but we don't have the budget to make them happen.
Yeah.
One reason we don't, Garcia and Carrington also point out, is because we're subsidizing what in effect is a failing industry.
Well, in fact, if you were to pay the full freight for a gallon of gas or a pound of plastic, gas would be $12 to $15 to $16, and plastic would cost 10 to 12 times as much as it currently does, as far as I can tell.
Right. So,
and that hasn't been covered by anybody other than The Guardian and a few small organizations. How do you suggest, what advice would you give to a reporter at a mainstream organization trying to cover this story right?
I think again, this ties back to something we were talking about a moment ago, which is in effect that corporate news coverage portrays a corporate view and understanding of the world. So the corporate news media are not by and large going to be interested in having this story be well understood because it undercuts the interests of some of their major sponsors, right? This is why I'll sound like a parrot or a broken record. The importance of independent journalism is that reporters like Carrington at The Guardian and Garcia at Tree Hugger are going to talk to different sources. They're going to talk to people who aren't company spokespeople. So I think that's part of it. I do think those numbers are bafflingly large to most of us, and so it's important to try to put them into some context. And then I think, I don't think this is, again, I fully expected when we started researching this story to find that it had received some solid establishment, some solid coverage in the establishment press, because I don't think this is actually a complicated story. There are direct subsidies that are things like tax breaks and other things that reduce the cost of doing business. And then there are these indirect subsidies that basically are what economists call externalities. The fossil fuel industry doesn't pay the true cost of its doing business. It offloads those costs to the public, right? So
bingo.
So, but that's not a complex idea, but it's an idea that cuts against the interests of major corporations, and therefore is less palatable, more likely to be in effect filtered out in corporate news coverage.
Well, and I think the other expression of that or lack of expression of it is the failure to translate that into the fact that we are paying for this at the expense of the other investments that we would want to make as a society. And the irony is that we are being told that we shouldn't count externalities that we can now measure, when in fact we can today say, look, here, we can measure the impact of not doing this today because it's going to hit our grandchildren tomorrow in this way.
And again, just to be clear, like the externalities, like you don't have to be a fancy economist, right? The externalities that the fossil fuel industry isn't covering are the true costs of the climate crisis, health impacts of air pollution, even although it sounds like, oh my gosh, this is such a small thing, like the human and economic costs of car crashes, right? Which is not an inconsequential statistic when you start looking at annual figures. None of these bills are footed by the fossil fuel industry. They're all part of what the IMF study calculated as, in effect, indirect subsidies. The other angle to this story is that this is a global problem, but there are 5 countries that far and away lead in fossil fuel subsidies. And you can guess whether or not the US is among these. It is, as is India, China, Japan, and Russia. Those 5 countries are responsible for 2/3 of all the federal subsidies. So in the United States, we're talking about in 2020, some $730 billion in direct and indirect subsidies from US government to the fossil fuel industry. So again, we're told, like, well, there isn't money for public transportation. We're in a crisis when it comes to rebuilding our infrastructure.
Yeah. That figure, the 700 billion, is roughly the size of our defense budget,
which is gargantuan.
Yes, the biggest in the world. And yet we are also spending that on oil. This is such an important conversation. We need to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back. Let's get back to the conversation with Andy Lee Roth. He's the Associate Director of the Media Freedom Foundation's Project Censored program. So, Andy, another environmental story that captures a form of victimization that just isn't covered at all is the impact of human technology on animals. You wrote about BuzzFlash's coverage of military and deep sea industry technology on whales. So-called smart ocean technology is deafening whales. Did BuzzFlash's coverage get other media outlets to cover the story?
There was a little bit of pickup on this. So this was originally a story produced by the Independent Media Institute and first published by BuzzFlash, and other independent outlets did pick this up. So this story was also covered in Counterpunch, Monthly Review, the Socialist Project, but we didn't find traction for this story in the corporate news media. We found components of this is really, I think of this story as a three-part story. And you can find in the corporate news media one part or another part covered, but you can't find all the dots connected to tell the full story that Kuhan Pike Mander originally reported for the Independent Media Institute and BuzzFlash.
So tell us about the three facets of the story and how they're connected.
Some of them you've already laid out in your introduction. There are first joint military and industry efforts to develop new ocean technologies, this idea of the smart ocean. So that's one. Those have lethal consequences for whales. That's the second part. And whales, besides us being maybe concerned about whales as life forms in their own right, whales play an indispensable role in helping the ocean to sequester carbon and therefore mitigating the climate catastrophe. So those three parts all together make this story. You can find fragments of that story in various corporate news outlets, but not the whole constellation that Pike Mander reported.
Well, and this smart ocean technology is being applied at the very frontiers of human knowledge and awareness in the deepest parts of the ocean to enable mining and military practices. But the relationship to wildlife, and for instance, the way that whales actually help mix the content of different layers of the ocean, and that's how they contribute to accelerating the recovery of carbon from the atmosphere, doesn't ever get tied together in these conversations. And I read these stories in Nature scientific reports, and translating those into other impacts is also an awful lot of additional work. Is the media equipped to make those connections today? How would you change it if we were going to do it right?
I think really the key is perspective. That like you have to have a holistic perspective. You have to be thinking about how things interconnect. And Pike Mander's reporting on this topic is a great example of that, right? So, but that requires a great deal of expertise on the reporter's part, right? You have to understand the role that whales play in bringing phytoplankton to the surface of the water, of the ocean water, right? And how photosynthesis of phytoplankton is part of part of carbon sequestration. Then you have to understand that a lot of smart ocean technology relies on sonar, and you have to have enough of a kind of background perspective to know that sonar sonar is widely used by the military, but is now increasingly being used for these industrial applications.
Right.
And sonar, again, if you read the scientific journals, you know that sonar has these impacts on whales. In many cases, sonar sounds to many species of whales like their most mortal enemies, killer whales, and leads therefore whales who hear or sense sonar signals to do all kinds of terrible things, like beaching themselves in mass because they're terrified. So, I mean, when you think about all the things that Pike Mander had to triangulate in order to tell this story, you could say, wow, that's a lot of knowledge. On the other hand, like, I'm not an expert in any of those things. My work is as a media literacy educator, and I help coordinate the campus affiliates program at Project Censored. But once I read Pike Mander's story, forgive me, like, I can understand it. I may not be able to have a debate with an advanced scientist about some of the finer points of the story, but I can understand the broad strokes that make this an important story that more people ought to know about.
Which is the essence of a citizen's responsibility in a democratic society.
Bingo.
And so, well, let's move on to the next story, because this one actually illustrates for me some of the challenges of being aware of these issues, but not being aware of the fact everybody else isn't. So I was surprised by the fact that you included stories about wealthy nations continuing to drive climate change at a much higher rate than low income and emerging nations. I believe I see this story several times a week. Am I just living in a bubble?
Well, I don't want to comment on that, Mitch, but I think yes. And in fact, Project Censored covered basically the same story in our previous year's story list, as climate debtor nations have colonized the atmosphere, which was on our 2022 State of the Free Press list of stories, based on reporting that came out in the journal Lancet Planetary Health. So what's new here, right? I mean, Project Censored is not immune to these definitions of news. That we can't just run the same stories in our top 25 list every year, can we?
Might need to until we pay attention.
Well, that's part of it. We had an internal debate about this story because it does have new information. This story is, the Project Censored version of the story is based on two reports, a report by Sonia Klinsky in The Conversation called Climate Change is a Justice Issue, and also reporting from Quartz Africa by Tawanda Korombo about African countries that are among the world's worst hit by climate change. And what we decided, so the internal debate among our judges was, well, we covered this story last year, didn't we? We should, that might mean we would want to revisit that story, as we do every year. We have a feature called Deja Vu News, where the project goes back and looks at what's happened to previous year's top 25 stories. Right. Have they broken through to more mainstream wide coverage? Have there been developments in the story itself? So we debated for a while, and the thing that was the clincher on this is Klinsky's report. Sonia Klinsky is a professor in the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University, and what they're reporting about is based on some of the research they've done that looks at carbon emissions in long-term historical perspective. And this, I think, has not been as much part of the dialogue as it perhaps should be. So first, some obvious things. When you look back from the 1990s to 2015, 5% of the world's population is responsible for more than 36% of total greenhouse gas emissions. The impoverished 50% of the global population accounts for less than 6% of all total global emissions in that period. And that very much fits the model of of carbon emission debtors and creditors that we featured in last year's story on this same topic. But greenhouse gases have been in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. And so part of what Sonia Klinsky's study does is to go back all the way to the 18th century and track carbon emissions historically. Right. And when you do that, you see that like since the 1750s, the US has emitted 29% of all global carbon CO2 emissions, or 457 billion tons. The entire continent of Africa in that same period of 300 between 2 and 300 years has emitted only 3%, right? So the angle of this story that's most interesting to me is we are starting to see corporate news media in the United States covering environmental racism as a domestic issue, right? So we can talk about places like the communities around the port of Long Beach in California. And we can talk about the so-called Cancer Alley along the Mississippi in the southeastern United States.
These are described as fence line communities, that they're
exactly
right up against the polluting source.
Yes, exactly. And there's actually a fantastic documentary of just that name, Fence Line, that looks at the divisions in this community.
These divisions are global too. And,
yes,
and that story doesn't come through.
That's what's not being covered in the corporate press, right? So the idea that there is that the U.S. is playing this extraordinary role in speeding up the effects of climate change, which has disproportionate effects on whatever you want to call it, the global South, the developing world. That angle is completely missing from kind of the establishment press coverage of this story, and that was, to me, a major reason to run this story again. But you're quite right. Like, at a glance, this looks like, oh, well, Project Censored already covered that. You guys must be running out of stories to cover.
No, it's just the story continues to evolve and grow. So let me ask you this. Our audience wants to be well informed. And I've thought a lot about how I spend my reading and media time. And I have a set of journals that I read. I think the new Nature Plus subscription, which allows you to read any nature journal for $32 a month. That's expensive for a lot of people, but it is one of the most powerful sources of information I have. But then, there's a few other magazines or publications that I will go to on a regular basis, The Economist being one of them, for instance, in order to get a kind of a global view. But then there are the small press, like Tree Hugger, for instance, that I will go read, or Sightline Institute out of Seattle is another that does very good climate coverage. And what mix would you recommend, based on the research that you've been doing, of that somebody should read on a regular basis or watch?
I mean, I think at some level, it's looking to independent news sources, and there are fantastic independent news sources out there.
How do you suggest finding them?
I'll do a shameless plug here. On the Project Censored website, which is projectcensored.org, we have down at the footer of the page a listing of independent news sources that is broken down into 13 different common kind of news categories, one of which is the environment. Now, it's almost impossible to establish and maintain an authoritative list of independent news sources.
Sure.
We live in kind of what I think of as kind of a golden age of independent news reporting right now, thanks in part to an open and free internet. So, I mean, I think, we can point people there to these independent news sources, places, like the DeSmog blog, the Earth Island Journal. There are more than I can name, and I hesitate to name any without seeming to privilege one and unduly or unfairly ignore others. But I also want to step back from particular sources to get at something that is kind of almost an underlying assumption if we start talking about particular sources, an underlying assumption that I think doesn't hold for the majority of the American public right now. And this is bigger than just coverage of environmental issues. I think this is something that affects how we connect with news in general. There's more and more evidence that suggests that the average American now is doing what critical media literacy scholars talk about as news snacking, which is, the metaphor is that of, you aren't sitting down to eat a meal, you're kind of munching on chips while you do something else.
Read headlines and summaries rather than the story.
While you're flipping through your phone, either riding the train or the bus to your job, or you're waiting in line at the supermarket, or whatever we're doing. And so we're not engaging news in a kind of focused way that would have been true in the past, when many Americans would have watched the TV news at dinner time, or they might have started the day by reading the newspaper while they had their morning cup of coffee. And so
it is not like when I was a child and you watched Walter Cronkite.
This is right. Yes, right. And there are things that are good about that. But one of the downsides is that when we engage in news snacking, we're vulnerable to whatever the feeds are that are providing news to us. So maybe it's your social media, right? We know, this is something that the project has done a lot of work on. We know, for instance, that Facebook, the AI, the algorithms that generate your Facebook feed, and this is true of other social media platforms as well. So I don't mean to exclusively focus on Facebook, but it's useful as a concrete example. We know that those algorithms are not neutral. Right? They have biases baked into them. We don't know exactly, because the algorithms are considered intellectual property. So we can only study kind of how they work from outside, from their effects. But we know that they don't provide a kind of a neutral filtering of information. And so the problem here is, if I'm relying on a social media platform to tell me what's happening in the world, I'm getting a filtered version of the world that is in effect doubly filtered. It's what the most prominent news outlets are covering, as selected by the algorithm that organizes my social media feed. Now, in that process, a lot of the kind of independent news outlets or more scientifically focused journals that you're reading they're simply filtered out. They aren't making it through.
Well, interestingly, I do see them, because my feed, I respond to them. So in some sense, I'm tuning my feed, but that does not credit the feed with any utility at all. It's more a matter of happenstance, because it's not systematic on my part. But this also comes to the other, and this is the last thing I wanted to talk with you about, is in addition to these missed stories or these missed controversies, we also, because of that snacking, no longer dig into the deeper issues that we actually are making progress on. And even there's an example of this. Amanda Ripley wrote a piece in the Washington Post recently about the work of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. And they actually managed to pass 202 bipartisan recommendations for reforming Congress after January 6th, which was astonishing, but nobody covered it until this one story. Are we, and I acknowledge the stories that Project Censored has identified need far deeper and broader coverage, but does the press also need to look beyond controversy to how we can cooperate? Because that seems to be missing from the dialogue too.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I want to come at it a couple different ways. One is, I would say, whose cooperation, right? Some of what we've been talking about today with the stories featured in this year's Project Censored Top 25 story list reflect, I think, sophisticated and impactful cooperation between corporate news outlets and corporate entities.
Yeah.
So that kind of cooperation is problematic because it means the press isn't functioning in its watchdog role. It's more like a lapdog on a corporate or a government leash. And that's a problem, of course. But without kind of twisting your question around too much, I would come back and say, exactly. We need one of the most underreported kind of categories of stories, and you can see this over 47 years of Project Censored Top 25 Story Lists, is what we now know as solutions journalism.
Yeah.
Right. So solutions journalism is a version of journalism that focuses on communities coming together to address systemic problems. So solutions journalism is not the feel-good piece at the end of the evening news broadcast where the cat is stuck in the tree and the firefighters come with the hook and ladder to rescue the cat. That's a great story for firefighters and cats, but that's not solutions journalism. Solutions journalism is about groups of people coming together to address systemic problems. And
for instance, how did you pay for the fire engine in the first place?
Yeah, right. Or, how is progress being made in terms of, say, regenerating coral reefs that are being damaged by ocean acidification? That's a solutions journalism story. So I think a lot of people, certainly when I was teaching sociology, and I would ask my students, what news sources do you follow? A bunch of them would be candid enough to say, Professor Andy, I don't really follow the news. And I'd say, why not? And they'd say, it's too depressing. And I'd say, maybe you're following the wrong kind of news.
I hear that a lot.
So solutions journalism. So, the Solutions Journalism News Tracker is a fantastic online source that aggregates examples of solutions journalism from not only independent, but also corporate news outlets. And I think that speaks to your question about cooperation. I think this is my opinion now. So I think a lot of corporate news is intended, its subtext is to convince us that there's little for us to do except as passive consumers.
I believe that is also a reflection of the approach people have to branding, where it has to be perfect and solves all your problems, rather than recognizing we live in complex times and there's a future to co-design rather than just take as it's given to.
Yeah. And look, propaganda always simplifies. So if you think about a lot of the news as in effect having a propaganda-like effect to depoliticize us, to deactivate us, it then makes sense that there won't be a lot of establishment news coverage about solutions, about effective cooperation, because that undermines one of the main purposes of news, if you're thinking of news as having a propaganda-like function. And so I think it's important then to seek out outlets that help remind us of what's best about human beings and what's possible when human beings cooperate across all kinds of differences in order to work towards solutions that serve a common public good. But that worldview is, I think, at odds with a for-profit corporate understanding of the world and how humans work in the world.
It is also at odds with the algorithms that try to get us to click, which I think amplifies the problem pretty dramatically.
Right, and we know that those algorithms promote material that plays on our fears. That, first of all, plays on our emotions, and in particular, plays on our fear, our fear of others, our fear of you name it. And so those things don't play to what's best in human endeavor and human character. And we need news that does.
How can our listeners follow your work? It's really important that they keep tuned into this.
Thanks so much, Mitch. Well, you can find us at projectcensored.org. The Project Censored radio show airs on some 50 terrestrial radio stations across the US, from New York to Hawaii, every week. And although we're critical of the algorithms that drive the social media platforms, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and the like as well. So, and people can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter, which we send out by email each month as a way of avoiding those algorithms.
Well, Andy, thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thanks so much, Mitch. It's a pleasure to be with you.
We've been speaking with the Associate Director of the Media Freedom Foundation's Project Censored program, Andy Lee Roth. You can read his Earth911 article, Corporate Media Fiddle as the Planet Burns, to find links to the independent news outlets that did cover the underreported environmental and climate stories of 2022. And visit projectcensored.org, that works either with or without a dash, projectcensored.org, to find more information, sign up for their newsletter, and look for that Solutions News feed service. You know, we live in a world awash in information. That information needs context to become useful knowledge. The press can do that job responsibly and honestly, but often operate without the resources needed because journalism today has to pay its way inside big companies. We mentioned Walter Cronkite and CBS News during the conversation because, in a sense, it represented the high watermark in corporate journalism. The network, which was only one of 3 national broadcasters at the time, was urged by news pioneer Edward R. Murrow to recognize that its entire reputation across the entire network depended on the level of trust its audience felt towards its news. News didn't need to be profitable at CBS because it was an investment in reputation. And now Murrow has been gone for 58 years, and every news organization has to make a profit while competing with thousands of sites and newsletters for an audience. It is a golden age, as Andy said, in terms of choices that exist in a world of filters, but those filters can close off citizens from the news they need. There's no easy solution to all this media mayhem, just like there's no clear path out of the climate crisis. Perhaps, though, the solution to these problems are intertwined, and we'll find new economic models to support the transparency and analysis that our complex society requires in order to facilitate the next generation of democracy and free choice. Just an aside, at Earth911, we're focused on solutions and helping you interpret the choices you have when shopping, at work, where you shape the choices presented to others, and in public debates about what exactly we mean by sustainability and its goals. And you can help by sharing this podcast and the more than 380 other interviews on sustainability in your ear. Would you take a moment to share a review on your favorite podcast platform? You folks are the amplifiers that can spread more ideas to create less waste. Please tell your friends, family, coworkers that they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other purveyors of podcast goodness that you prefer. Thank you very much for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we'll be back soon with another innovator interview. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.